The night we buried my mother, while her friends were still in the living room, telling stories about her and picking at the food she would have hated, too salty. She always said, "Caterers never season properly." Her husband of 3 years pulled me aside in the hallway and told me he needed me out of the basement suite by the end of the following week. I stood there in my funeral clothes, holding a paper plate I hadn't touched, looking at the man who had spent the last 3 years slowly dismantling the life my mother had built. My stepfather was 61 years old, silver-haired, the kind of man who wore a blazer to a grocery run. He said it with the practiced calm of someone who had rehearsed the conversation, not unkindly, almost sympathetically, as if he were doing me a favor by giving me 7 days instead of 30. "The house will need to be listed soon," he said. "Probate moves quickly in Ontario when things are in order." I had $94 in my bank account. I had a 12-year-old pickup truck that wasn't mine. I'd borrowed it from a coworker 6 months earlier when my own car finally gave out. And somewhere in the inside pocket of my suit jacket, I had a folded photocopy of a document I didn't understand yet. A property deed for something called the Thorne Family Holding, 41 acres, and an old farmhouse in Haliburton County, registered in my mother's maiden name. I'd found it at the bottom of a shoebox in her closet the week before the funeral, when my stepfather had asked me to sort through her personal items. I'd pocketed it without knowing why. "Fine," I said to him, "I'll be out." His son, Preston, was standing just inside the kitchen doorway, watching our exchange with the particular smirk of a man who already knows who won. He raised his wine glass slightly, a toast only he found funny. He was 34, worked in finance, and had spent the last 3 years treating our family home like a hotel he had no obligation to maintain. I walked out the front door and sat in the borrowed truck in the November dark for a long time before I could make myself start the engine. My mother, Margaret Thorne, had built her life on precision and stubbornness. She'd grown up in Haliburton, the kind of Ontario countryside where you learn to drive on dirt roads and can actually see the Milky Way. And she came to Toronto in her early 20s with a community college diploma and no safety net. By the time I was born, she'd turned a property cleaning contract into a small management company. By the time I was 12, she had a staff of 19 people managing rental properties across the east end of the city. She was not wealthy in the way that gets written about in newspapers, but she had built something real, something she owned completely, and she never once forgot what it had cost her. My father left when I was 8. She didn't speak badly about him, she just kept working. She met my stepfather at a charity event for a children's hospital, introduced through a mutual acquaintance, presented as a semi-retired investment consultant, a widower. He was charming in the way that men who have had a lot of practice being charming can be. She was 62, recently recovered from a minor cardiac procedure, and I think she was tired of doing everything alone. I understood that. I still wish I had paid closer attention. Within a year, he had moved in. Within 18 months, they were married at a small ceremony in Muskoka that I attended with a feeling I couldn't name at the time, but recognize now as dread. The changes came gradually, and then, suddenly, they didn't. My mother started missing details at work, things she never would have missed before. She confused the names of tenants she'd managed for a decade. She told me once, over the phone, that she felt like she was thinking through Cotton, her new doctor. Not the one she'd had for 15 years, but a specialist my stepfather had recommended, told her it was age-related cognitive slowing and prescribed a medication that seemed to make everything worse. I brought it up with my stepfather once. He looked at me with patient, practiced disappointment and said that it was hard to watch a parent age and that he hoped I'd find a way to be supportive rather than combative. 14 months after the wedding, my mother had a massive stroke in the kitchen of the home she'd owned for 23 years. She spent 9 weeks in the hospital. She never recovered enough to speak clearly again. She died on a Wednesday morning in early April, with my stepfather on one side of the bed and me on the other. I held her hand, I don't know if she knew I was there. The will reading happened in a glass-walled boardroom downtown, 7 days after we put her in the ground. The lawyer, a man named Ashford, who worked out of an office that looked expensive in the way that signals someone else is paying for it, had the kind of formal, practiced neutrality I've since learned means he already knows how this ends and feels bad about exactly none of it. My stepfather sat at the head of the table. Preston sat beside him, scrolling his phone. The will was precise and thorough and left me with almost nothing. The house on Danforth, gone to my stepfather. The business accounts and operational rights to Thorne Property Management, transferred to him under a management trust he'd been named executor of. The RRSPs, the vehicle, the personal savings, all of it, his. The document cited her desire that the business continue under capable stewardship, and that her husband be provided for in his retirement years. To her son Gavin, the will continued, she left the property known as the Thorne Family Holding, located in Haliburton County, Ontario, including all structures thereon. She hoped he would find peace there, as she once had. I knew the property. My grandparents had owned it. My mother's parents. An old farmhouse, a workshop my grandfather had built himself, 41 acres of second-growth forest and one creek. It had been sitting empty since my grandmother died 12 years ago, the property taxes paid faithfully by my mother every year, but the buildings left untouched. The last time I'd been there was a summer weekend when I was 17. That property has unpaid municipal levies going back 4 years, Ashford said, as if he were being helpful. You'd want to sort that out before it goes to tax sale. My stepfather was already standing, adjusting his jacket. We should have lunch soon, he said to me, the way people say things they don't mean. Family is important, even through transitions. Preston held the door open for his father without looking at me. I sat at that table alone for a few minutes after they left, looking at the photocopy of the deed I'd brought in my jacket. The registered name on it was Margaret Helen Thorne, not her married name, not the name she'd used since the wedding. Ashford, who had come back in to collect his files, noticed me staring at it. The Haliburton property was registered prior to the marriage, he said carefully, under her legal name at the time. The will does stipulate it passes to you. Why would she keep it in her maiden name? He straightened his papers. I wouldn't know. But something in the way he said it told me he at least had a guess. I arrived at the Thorne property on a Thursday evening in late November, 6 days after I'd packed everything I owned into the bed of the borrowed truck. The drive north from Toronto takes about 3 hours in good conditions. The highway gives way to 2-lane roads, then gravel, then a track so overgrown I had to get out twice to move fallen branches. When my headlights swept across the farmhouse, I sat in the cab for a long moment before I could make myself get out. The building was still standing, but only technically. The front porch had collapsed on one end, the wood rotted through. The roof had developed a significant sag on the east side, and the whole structure wore the particular gray pallor of wood that hasn't seen paint in over a decade. The workshop behind it was in slightly better shape, probably because my grandfather had built it with heavy timbers, over-engineered in the way people who grew up through scarcity tend to build things. There was no power connected. The propane tank was empty. The water pump in the basement required a part I wouldn't find until the hardware store in town opened Friday morning. I rolled out a sleeping bag on the kitchen floor, ate a gas station sandwich I'd bought in Minden, and listened to the wind find every gap in the farmhouse's siding. At some point that first night, I stopped pretending I wasn't crying. I cried for my mother, for the slow way she'd been taken from me before she was even gone, for the fact that I was 28 years old and sleeping on the floor of a property I couldn't afford to heat, having lost in a single year my apartment, my job stability, and the person who had been the fixed point of my entire life. But by morning, something had hardened in me. Grief has a texture, and I'd hit the bottom of it. What was underneath was just cold anger and the stubborn refusal to be beaten. If this was what I'd been given, I would make it livable. I would sell it, use the money to hire someone to look properly at what my stepfather had done to my mother's accounts, and I would find a way to undo whatever could be undone. The first 2 weeks I focused on basics. I got the water pump running with a replacement part from the hardware store in town. An older man behind the counter there, who had known my grandparents, gave me a deal without making a big deal of it. I patched the worst of the roof sag with a tarp and lumber I found stacked in the workshop. I set up a propane camping heater in the kitchen and lived primarily in that one room. I ate from cans and Tim Hortons drive-thrus in town and spent evenings reading, or trying to. It was the ice storm in early December that changed everything. It came in fast from the northwest, the way Ontario storms do when they mean it. The temperature dropped 15 degrees in 4 hours, and freezing rain started at midnight. By 3 in the morning, the weight of ice on the trees surrounding the workshop was producing sounds I'd never heard before. Cracks like rifle shots, the groan of wood under load, and then, just after 4, a crash loud enough to bring me out of my sleeping bag and into the workshop with a flashlight before I'd fully registered I was awake. A section of the roof over the back corner had given way. Not the whole thing, the old beams had held, but a gap about a meter wide had opened where 2 rafters had failed, and the ceiling boards had come down with them. Ice and debris covered the old workbench in the corner. I started pulling the debris away to check the structural damage. The rafters had separated from the ridge beam, but hadn't snapped. It was repairable. But as I cleared the mess of insulation and broken board, my flashlight caught something that didn't belong. Tucked between 2 joists, in the part of the roof cavity that had stayed dry, was a waterproof plastic container, the kind you buy at an outdoor supply store for camping, with a rubber gasket seal. It was secured with a short length of electrical cord. On the side, in black marker, in my mother's handwriting, G. I sat down on the cold workshop floor and held it in both hands for a long moment. Inside was a small notebook, the kind she had always kept at her desk at work, soft cover, elastic band closure. Taped to the inside front cover was a folded piece of paper that read at the top, "If you found this, then something went wrong, and I'm sorry you have to deal with it alone." She had started keeping the notebook 18 months before she died. The entries were short and precise. She wrote the way she talked, no extra words. The first ones described noticing discrepancies in the business accounts. Money moved from the operating account to a numbered company my stepfather had set up, initially in small amounts, then in transfers running into the tens of thousands. She'd confronted him. He'd explained it as restructuring. Tax efficiency, he said, standard practice. But something felt wrong, and she knew the difference between "I don't understand this" and "something is being hidden from me." She'd switched doctors quietly, without telling him. The new doctor, she called her only Dr. P in the notebook, had reviewed her existing cardiac medication alongside the new prescription and flagged a dangerous interaction. The new medication was raising her blood pressure in ways that compounded her existing heart vulnerability. The entries didn't use the word poisoned, but they didn't have to. Then, 8 months before her death, I went to Haliburton alone last weekend. I told Lawrence I was meeting a friend from high school. I needed to do this somewhere he'd never think to look. This property is still in my name from before. He's never asked about it, and I don't believe he knows it exists. I met with a notary in town, and we drew up a proper document. I've put what's needed in the root cellar. And then, in the final entry, written 11 weeks before her stroke, "Gavin, 3rd flagstone from the north wall in the workshop root cellar. I love you." I read that line 3 times. Then I put the notebook in my jacket pocket and went to the workshop's root cellar door. The root cellar was my grandfather's work. Stone walls, a plank door, a low ceiling that had required him to duck his head. It was cold as a refrigerator even in summer. The floor was flagstone, irregular pieces of local granite he'd laid himself, and it still smelled of earth and old preserves that had lived there for 40 years. I counted from the north wall, 3rd stone. It was large, flat, and hadn't moved in a long time. I needed the crowbar from the truck, and then I needed 20 minutes of real effort. The stone was mortared around its edges with decades of compacted dirt and had settled under its own weight. I broke the seal a centimeter at a time, levered it up, wedged a block of wood under the gap. My arms were shaking by the time it finally pivoted clear. Underneath, loose gravel, about 30 centimeters deep. I cleared it with my hands, and my knuckles hit something hard just below the surface. A pelican case, smaller than a briefcase, matte black, sealed with a padlock. I hauled it out, carried it up into the workshop, and used the crowbar on the padlock. It took 4 strikes. The case was waterproof and had done its job. Everything inside was perfectly dry. The first document was a will, properly formatted, signed, witnessed, notarized by a Haliburton notary whose stamp was clear. It was dated 8 months before my mother's stroke. It left me the house on Danforth, the full operational rights to Thorne Property Management, all registered assets, and a specific instruction that her husband had no claim on anything she'd owned prior to the marriage. A handwritten note at the bottom, initialed by both her and the notary, stated that any will purporting to supersede this one, signed after the date of her cardiac diagnosis, should be considered under duress. The second item was a USB drive in a sealed bag, written on the label in her handwriting, "Lawrence calls." The third was a manila envelope containing bank statements, wire transfer records, and printed screenshots of account activity. $340,000 moved out of Thorne Property Management over 14 months into numbered companies with no registered addresses. Beneath those, a letter from Dr. P. to my mother's former cardiologist, dated 4 months before the stroke, expressing concern about the prescribed medication. The combination was clinically inadvisable for her specific condition, the letter said, and requested urgent review. There was no record the message had ever been acknowledged. I was sitting cross-legged on the cold workshop floor, going through all of it, when I heard tires on the gravel drive. I knew who it was before I reached the door. My stepbrother was dressed for the city, wool coat, leather Oxfords already ruined by the mud, standing beside a rented Jeep with his arms loose at his sides. He was holding a hunting rifle across his body, barrel down, in the practiced way of someone who has used one before and knows exactly how it looks. "I figured you'd be here by now," he said. His breath fogged in the cold air. Lawrence had the county flag the property in the land registry system. A simple request. Cost nothing. "We got pinged when you paid the back taxes last month." I stayed in the workshop doorway. "He waited to see if you'd actually show up," my stepbrother continued. "I've been at the motel in Minden for 4 days." He nodded toward the pelican case on the floor behind me. "Whatever that is, hand it over." "It's old tools," I said. "Hardware, nothing worth driving 4 hours for." "Don't." He wasn't angry, that was the thing. He was businesslike about it, the way he was businesslike about everything. "Lawrence can spot a lie. He knew your mother was hiding something the moment she stopped arguing with him. Hand it over and we move on. You keep the land, we get the rest. It's already settled. You drove 4 hours in December with your father's hunting rifle to ask me nicely." Something flickered across his face. "Hand over the case, Gavin." The USB drive was in my left jacket pocket. I'd put it there without thinking when I heard the car, the same way you pocket your wallet when something feels wrong. The rest of the documents were in the case behind me. I glanced down at the flagstone debris I'd stacked beside the root cellar door. Loose gravel, a few rock shards. My stepbrother's eyes moved to the pelican case for a fraction of a second. I grabbed a fistful of gravel and threw it directly at his face. He flinched hard, and I was already moving, through the workshop's back door, into the trees. I heard him shout, heard him scramble. Then the first shot, which went nowhere near me, but was loud enough to clear my mind of everything except the land under my feet. I knew this property. I had run these trees as a teenager, knew where the creek bent, knew that the old logging road came out on the county road about 2 kilometers north. The ice storm had left everything slick and treacherous, but I grew up in this province and I understood what it asked of you. I moved fast and low, staying under the tree line, crossing the creek at the shallow bend where the rocks sat close together. The water came up past my ankles and was shocking cold, but I crossed and kept moving. My stepbrother fired twice more from somewhere behind and south of me, wild shots, directionless. Then I heard him swearing, then nothing but wind. I crawled under a fallen spruce at the edge of the property line and lay in the snow for 40 minutes, listening. The cold worked its way into my soaked boots and then deeper. I focused on breathing slowly, on waiting. Eventually I heard his Jeep start, heard it idle, then pull away down the gravel track. I waited another 20 minutes before I moved. I drove through the night, not to the OPP detachment in Minden. My stepfather had money and Toronto lawyers, and a man showing up with mud on his face and a story about conspiracy would spend 12 hours being processed while those lawyers made calls. I needed something bigger, something that could move faster than his money could. I drove south to Peterborough, where the RCMP ran a financial crimes unit out of a shared office building. I'd learned about it a year earlier when a property management fraud case in the East End had made local news, the kind of thing my mother had followed closely as someone in the industry. I arrived at 7:40 in the morning, looking like I'd lost a disagreement with a provincial park. The duty officer looked at me the way you look at someone you're still deciding about. I put the USB drive on the counter in its sealed bag and asked to speak to whoever handled financial crimes. It took an hour. The RCMP sergeant who eventually came down was a woman about 50 with close-cropped gray hair and reading glasses on a lanyard. She set a coffee in front of me without asking and let me talk for 20 minutes without interrupting. When I finished, she picked up the evidence bag and looked at the USB drive through the plastic. The physical documents, they're still at the property. Still in the workshop. I didn't have time to take the case. You think the stepbrother went back for it. I think he went back to the motel to call his father. I think they're deciding what to do. She looked at me over her glasses for a moment. The notary on the will, you have a name? I'd written it in my phone from my mother's notebook. She made a note of it. We're going to need to move fast if a legitimate will is being contested, she said. And we need to preserve what's in that root cellar before it disappears. She picked up her desk phone. Give me the address of the property. The RCMP Financial Crimes Team and the Ontario Property Fraud Unit move quickly when the evidence is concrete and the dollar amounts are significant enough. $340,000 in documented transfers and a will potentially obtained through manipulation got people's attention in a way that my word alone never would have. A team was at the Haliburton property by early afternoon. The Pelican case was still in the workshop, exactly where I'd left it. My stepbrother's rental Jeep tracks in the snow showed he'd come back, walked to the workshop door, and left without going inside, either spooked or unwilling to break the lock without me there to make it look like something else. The Haliburton notary confirmed her signature and her seal. The documents were genuine. The will was genuine. 3 weeks later, my stepfather was arrested at his office in the financial district on charges of fraud, breach of fiduciary duty, and criminal misappropriation of property. The Crown Attorney also opened an investigation into his conduct around my mother's medical care. Specifically, whether he had knowingly arranged a medication combination contraindicated for her cardiac condition, and whether that constituted criminal negligence causing death. The recordings on the USB drive contained 4 phone conversations in which my stepfather discussed with a third party, at length, how to ensure the business assets were moved before the medical situation resolves. Those were his words exactly. The medical situation. My stepbrother was charged with criminal threatening and unsafe discharge of a firearm. He cooperated with the RCMP investigation to limit his own exposure and gave a full statement against his father in exchange for a conditional sentence. He said it himself, on the record. He had known what his father was doing to my mother's finances for at least a year before her death. He'd said nothing. The legal process in Canada is slow, methodical, and in this case thorough. It took 11 months. I won't describe all of it because most of it was conference rooms and affidavits and the specific exhaustion of fighting for something that was already yours through someone else's lies. What I'll say is this: the real will was executed. Thorne Property Management came back to me, along with the house on Danforth and the accounts my stepfather hadn't yet managed to move. The manager who had worked for my mother for 14 years and been quietly sidelined was reinstated. Within 1 quarter, the company was running again. My stepfather received a 6-year federal sentence. The civil judgment against him consumed the majority of what he'd moved offshore. My stepbrother received a conditional sentence. I have not spoken to either of them since the day the charges were read. In the spring, I drove back up to Haliburton. I had taken a leave from managing the company directly. That's what I had a good manager for, and I needed to do this myself, with my hands, before I could think clearly about anything else. The farmhouse needed a new roof section, proper wiring, and a rebuilt porch. I hired a local crew for the structural work and did the finish carpentry myself. I'm a carpenter by trade, enough to know wood, to know how to work slowly and get something right. My grandfather had taught me on weekends during summers I spent up here as a kid. He'd start me on small things, a box joint, a simple mortise. He believed you learned the material before you learned the tool. The workshop I kept almost entirely as it was. The old bench, the tool hooks on the wall with half the tools still hanging there. His hand planes, rusted on the blades but structurally intact. I cleaned them, oiled the mechanisms, and hung them back up in the same arrangement. The root cellar I relaid properly. Poured a concrete floor over the original flagstone, sealed the walls. But the third stone from the north wall I kept. I had it cut and polished by a stonemason in town and mounted on the workshop wall as a shelf, flush and level at eye height. On the face of the stone carved into the granite, MHT. My mother's initials, from the name she'd always thought of as her own. It is not a monument to what she left me. It is a monument to the specific kind of courage it takes to quietly, carefully, without anyone knowing, build something that will outlast the thing that is trying to destroy you. My mother grew up in this county. She came to the city and built something real, and she came back here in secret to protect it. She put what mattered most beneath a flagstone in her own father's root cellar because she trusted that her son would eventually stand in that room and understand what she'd done and why. I stand in the workshop on Saturday mornings now, before the light has fully decided what it's doing, with coffee and whatever piece I'm working on. Sometimes I talk to her. I tell her about the company, about the tenants whose names she knew by heart. I tell her the property taxes on the Haliburton land are fully paid. I tell her the porch is solid now, and the creek is running high from the snowmelt, and the hand planes still work exactly as they should. My stepfather spent 3 years turning her into someone she wasn't. He took her clarity and her confidence in her own memory, one careful step at a time, and he nearly got away with it. Nearly. She built something he couldn't reach, buried the truth in the one place she knew he would never look, in the county where she was born, under a stone she had walked over her whole life. I found it, and now it belongs to no one but us.